Welcome back to the ZX10 project. Today we're going to have some rear end action. So the big task for today is to strip the rear shock out of the bike, take it apart and improve it. While I'm having that out, I will also take the shock linkage out and sort of service that. And you may already notice there is a shiny new tyre in it. But there may be a slight issue with that we have to come to later. So I have the bike on an abber stand, so the back wheel is off the floor and the bike is nice and sturdy. Now I just need to take the bolts out that hold the shock into the bike and into the shock linkage, and then I'm actually going to take the linkage off as well, take the shock out, take it upstairs and give it a bit of TLC.
If you're going to take the linkage out of the bike and then take it apart, it is easy to undo all the bolts first while it's in the bike.
So now I've got all of the linkage and everything loose and the nuts off the shock bolts. What I'm going to do is just wiggle the back wheel up a little bit so that I can get the bottom shock bolts out, and then everything's nice and free.
To get some of the weight off the back wheel, sometimes I find it easier to just stick my foot under it and give it a little bit of a wiggle with my toes.
Well, that didn't entirely go to plan because the shock doesn't want to come out the hole. But what I can do now is take the back wheel out, and that will allow the swinging arm to move a bit more, so I can get a bit more access.
Getting the back wheel out is fairly straightforward. Undo the big nut that holds everything together, then once it's on a paddock stand you can slide the spindle out and pull the wheel out the hole, just making sure that you don't sort of catch it on the brake caliper or anything and scratch it.
Right, now that I have the back wheel out, I have a lot more movement on the swinging arm, so hopefully now I can get my shock out. And there we go. One only slightly dirty shock absorber. So I've given the shock a little bit of a bath in the degrease tank to make it a little bit cleaner, because there's no point in me bringing it up here dirty. Right, the standard spring is a 10 kilogram per millimetre spring, and if you're 2 up or you're, a little more rotund than me, that's probably not too bad. But for me that's too hard, so I'm putting a 9 kilogram per millimetre spring on it. But that's not all. I'm also going to strip and rebuild the shock, so I've got a seal head kit there, and I have an uprated piston kit, so that will give better control than the stuff that's in there, which has too much rebound damping and is generally just a bit meh. Right then, let's get stripping. To take the spring off, you will require a spring compressor, and this is one I made many moons ago. So now the spring is off, we have the bit that just does the damping. And basically that's full of oil with a piston in it, and the cylinder at the end has a reservoir of nitrogen to keep everything pressurised. And the gas pressure should push the shock piston back up. But there's a lot of rebound damping on that, and that's actually wound as far off as it goes. Brilliant. The first job I need to do is release the gas pressure, and that we use a needle to do. So now I've let the gas pressure out, all I need to do is take the end off here, which is already loose, take the bladder out of this end, push the seal head down, take all the circlips out and pull it all apart. So to talk you through the elements of the shock, we have obviously the shock bottom that bolts into the swinging arm linkage, the rebound adjuster which actually affects all the damping. Then we have the bump stop at the bottom here for when you hit bottoms of bumps, just a cover plate there, and then this is the seal head that keeps all the oil in the shock. Right, up here we have a top out spring, so that when you jump the bike, or when you're braking really hard and the back wheel's off the floor, this doesn't just smack metal to metal. Sometimes they use like little rubber bump stops in effect for the top outs, but nowadays we tend to see more top out springs, so that's fairly stiff. And then we have the piston with all the shims on it. The top set of shims here are the rebound shims, the ones underneath here are compression, they're very similar, just sort of in reverse. And what happens is, as the piston moves up and down in the shock, oil goes through this big hole, and that pushes against the shim stack on the bottom and opens those, and that vice versa when the piston's going the other way, the oil goes up there and pushes these shims out of the way. Now, we don't actually want the shims to be in action all the time, so what we have is a bypass hole. So this bypass goes down here, and it comes out of a little hole just behind the top outspring that you can't see very well. And basically that just allows oil to go straight past the shim stack. So when the shock's moving fairly slowly, most of the oil will go through the bypass, and then as we hit harder bumps or we're going a bit faster, then the oil will be starting to push the shims out of the way. The bypass adjuster, which is down here, your sort of damping adjuster, that pushes the needle up and down inside the bypass. So when we lock that off, when we wind the adjuster all the way in, it locks the bypass off, so pretty much all the oil has to go through the shim stacks, so you get more damping. Okay, we have some adjustment on our damping, but I want the actual characteristic of the shock to be different, so I'm going to be changing the piston and the shim stacks, because obviously if we have different shim stacks or a sort of slightly different design of piston, then we can alter the feel that the shock generates. We can still have our bypass adjustment, but when the shims come into play, we want them to feel different. So to take it all apart, I'll just have to take that nut off. Seems fairly simple, except the manufacturers sort of peen the end of the shaft over so the nut can't ever come off, which means I need to grind the end of the shaft off first. Just a little detailed tickle will do it. So all I've done there is taken the sort of edge off with the grinder, undone the nut, and just given it a little bit of a file round so that I've actually got a chance of getting all the shim stack off. So all I'm going to do now is, one by one, take each element off, lay it out on a piece of rag in order, not that I'm going to be using much of it again, and then actually start rebuilding it with the new stuff. So there we have all of the elements laid out. Now, the rebound shims along the top are slightly smaller diameter, and there's lots of them. The compression ones are slightly bigger diameter, and there's lots of them. And then you've just got sort of a couple of spaces and bits, the top out spring and the seal head. Now, the seal head obviously has oil seals in it and a bush to keep everything in line, so we're going to be servicing that, changing the seals and the bush, and then fitting a different piston with different shims and a different piston design. So servicing the seal head is relatively straightforward. I just need to pick off this seal, drift the bush out of it, there's another seal inside, I'll be changing that, and then just drift a new bush and a seal back in it, and it's ready to go. So that's the seal head rebuilt. I've actually had to reuse the original dust seal because the one sent in the packet was wrong. The oil seal was also wrong, but I definitely need to replace that. But luckily, just a few miles up the road, Paul at Black and White Bikes had the correct one, so I had a little run up there and he sorted that out for me. So that's that rebuilt. The outer seal and the bush and bits have been replaced as well, so that can go back on the shaft, and then we can swap all of these bits for the new piston. So a smear of oil everywhere on there, and then gently slide it over the sort of the bullet so that we don't rip the seals. And that just slides down there. So that's our seal head fitted. Now I just need to fit my piston. So this is my new upgraded piston. The actual piston design is slightly different and the shim selection is quite a lot different. So I've just got to put that on. It'll be smaller shims are the rebound stack again. Obviously that just holds it all together for transport. So I'll be using a couple of the sort of big spaces and bits out of the old selection, but mostly this is the bit doing the work, so it should be quite a lot better to ride. So there we have my rebuilt shaft with the top out spring, which when I built it the second time I put on the right way round, and then all my new shim stack and piston. That's all Loctited and it is a locking nut. I am going to take it downstairs, give it everything a blow down with the airline, and then we can start actually rebuilding the rest of the shock. So the first bit of the rebuild, after I cleaned the body, was to put the bladder back in and just inflate it a little bit so it's taking up the right amount of space in the body. And now I need to pour some oil in it. I've oiled it up to sort of about there, and then as I put the piston in, obviously it's going to displace some of the oil, and I then need to work it up and down to get any air out of the system. A few short, sharp shocks just push the valves open a little bit, push the shims open and get any air out from inside there. So we'll work it a bit more, then we'll wait for all the air to escape out of it and put the seal head back in. Now that I have the seal head down far enough in the circular pin, what I need to do is regas the reservoir. Now I have some gas pressure in the reservoir, this should push down and push back up fairly well. Because the bypass on the piston actually affects the compression and the rebound, this adjuster affects both. So I've locked that off now, and you can see how much difference that makes to the compression damping. And it pretty much locks off the rebound. Whereas the compression adjuster, which was all the way out on that, if we wind that all the way in, doesn't really make that much difference. This is why the shims on the piston are really important, because the piston design and the shim stack on the piston affect compression and rebound, whereas your separate little rebound compression adjuster doesn't do that much. It's just really for fine-tuning over bumps. So now that I'm happy that the damping works nicely in the shock, what I'm going to do is just give it a final clean up, refit this sort of end plate, and I can put my new spring on. The shock might be ready to go back in the bike, but before I refit this, I'm going to take the shock linkage out, give it a good clean, and re-grease the bearings in it. So here we have the shock linkage out of the bike. Because I had all the bolts already loose, it was pretty easy, except I did have to loosen off a couple of bolts on the exhaust just so I could push it down a few millimetres and get one of the bolts out. If they'd have put it the other way round, it wouldn't have been a problem. Oh well. Right, pretty easy. Slide the rollers out. Everything looks pretty good in there. And all I'm going to do is smear a load of new grease in it, make sure that's nice and clean, and slide it all back together.
If the old grease isn't looking particularly nice, you can always give it a good wipe around inside and then smear plenty of new grease inside, just checking that the rollers have got no damage on them and there's no little play in the bearings.
Right, so that's the linkage all greased and cleaned up. It's all looking in really nice condition. There's one more bearing to do that sits in the bottom of the swinging arm, so I shall do that and then pop this all back together. So while my phone's been charging up a little bit, I've refitted the shock linkage and torqued everything up. The big bolts are 59 Newton meters, the small ones are 34. Given everything a little bit of a clean down there, refitted the shock, and I've given the inside of the swinging arm a bit of a clean and given the rear caliper a clean. So then, it's about time to put the wheel in. But there's a couple of little points to consider. You may remember earlier that this had a shiny new tyre on it, and now it has a not quite so new tyre on it. And there is a story behind this. When I first got the bike, I always decided I wanted to put a set of Dunlop TTs on it because they're a good sort of fast road track day tyre. And I wanted a 190 for the bike because it's the right size. Then I bought a pair and ended up putting them on my track bike to do some coaching for Rapid, which is why they look a little bit used. But then I managed to get a set of 120-200 tyres out of a bike I'd prepped up for my True Love, which meant I had a pair of tyres and a bike that needed some, so I put them on this wheel, and then realised it didn't fit, so I've now used the rear from the other bike in this bike, and the track bike tyre will go in the other one. And are you following this? Because I'm getting a little bit bored of it. Anyway, it's the right size tyre, it's had a little bit of use, but it's absolutely fine, and there is also a new sprocket, because I'm putting a chain of sprockets on the bike, so while the wheel is out, I fitted a new rear sprocket.
Putting a back wheel in a bike can be surprisingly awkward, but I do have a couple of little tips. I like to roll the wheel in, then hook the chain on and make sure the rear brake caliper is somewhere near the right place. Then I like to put my foot underneath it so that I can actually lift the weight of the wheel with my foot and pretty much have both hands free. And then it's just a case of hoping the wheel spaces haven't fallen out too far in advance, make sure they're nice and in, push the spindle through, and it should be fairly straightforward.
So that's the back wheel in. I like the foot under the back wheel thing to give it a bit of support while I wheel the spindle in. I'm not tightening this up yet because I'm going to change the front sprocket and the chain. Now, the chain of sprockets didn't actually look too bad, but they are original, therefore the chain's 17 years old, and I didn't really want to ride around on a 17-year-old chain for very long. So, I need to take the front sprocket cover off, undo the front sprocket, which being Kawasaki and original will be incredibly tight, and then cut the chain off. So the first step is to untab the tab washer that locks the front sprocket nut on, because Kawasaki don't want it falling off. Although they do them up that tight that it falling off is probably very unlikely. Now I notice that this tab washer has actually been re-tabbed before, which tells me that at some point somebody's had the sprocket off it, probably to fit a 16 tooth front, because you don't actually need to be able to do 104 miles an hour in first. So hopefully the sprocket will actually come off relatively easily. You can but hope. So, bike in gear. Not going to come off that easily. For a Kawasaki front sprocket nut, that was almost falling off. I did expect it to be harder, and what I've had to do before is actually wedge a bar through the back wheel against the swinging arm, and then pull on this until veins in my head were popping out. But that wasn't too bad at all. Now that everything's loose, what I can do is I can cut the chain off it, and then I'm ready to fit my new stuff. Now there's many tools available for pushing the pins out of these to split the chain, and they're all overkill. What you need is an angle grinder and then a chisel to just knock the end plate off. It's easy, it's effective. There we go, chain link removed. Chain split. One advantage with this bike not really having much chain lube on is there's not much chain lube to clear up, because there's only certain things in life that I really dislike. Lots and lots of chain lube is one, and the music of Mary J. Bilges is yet another. Right, so I've fitted the new front sprocket, had a little bit of a clean up around behind it. I've just done this up loose for now because we'll tighten it better when the chain is on. So I suppose really it'll put the chain on. So that's the chain wrapped around the sprocket, but there is currently a gap. So I'm just going to undo these a little bit, slide the wheel forward a few millimetres, and that will give us the correct chain length. So now we have the swinging arm length about right, the chain all lines up. So now all I've got to do now is put my rivet link in. So I've put my new O-rings at the end of my rivet link. Get plenty of grease in there because we want the rollers nice and greased. Because when you lube your chain up, all that's actually doing really is lubricating where the chain runs on the sprocket. It doesn't really get into here very well. So, plenty of grease for assembly. Pop the outer O-rings on, and I've just got my last cover plate. But we will have to tighten it up a little bit more than that. So to get the rivet link on a reasonable distance, a nice simple pair of pipe grips. And then we can push the link all the way on with the chain riveter. Now again, there are lots of different brands of chain riveters. Some of them are fancy, some of them are brand specific, so they push the link on exactly the right amount. This is a whale chain riveter. It is old school and it works perfectly. Little by little I wind the link on, just keeping an eye on it to make sure we don't crush the O-rings. Right then, I'm happy that I've pushed the link on far enough. We're not crushing the O-rings, but we're nice and snug up to them, and I have plenty of the rivet sticking out. So the next bit is to peen it over. And this involves this bit, which has a V in it that basically mushrooms the top of the rivet over. We may also be needing a hammer.
I like to pin each chain link in two positions. So I hit it once, and then I move it 90 degrees, I hit it again, and we're happy days.
So as you can see here, we've got nice peen marks, so the end plate definitely can't fall off. Everything's nice and snug. All I've got to do now is tighten the front sprocket up, reset the chain tension, and job's a carrot. So there we have it, my chain and sprockets fitted. I have a reasonable chain tension. It will probably bed in a little bit on the first ride. So that's happy days. I have stuck with the standard aesthetic because I quite like the fact the bike looks fairly standard. just should ride a little bit better. Right, one more job for this evening, and that is to change it into race shift. Now, on a road bike, the usual shift is one down and the rest of the gears up. On a race bike, you tend to have it the other way round. It's up for first and then down for the rest. The main reason for this is, on corner exit, if the bike's a bit leant over, it's a lot easier to push down on the lever than it is to try and get your foot underneath it at lean angle to hook the lever up. It is a little bit more stable as well, and you tend to get a more positive up change. To do this on a Kawasaki is nice and easy. All I need to do is undo this 10mm nut, or this 6mm bolt even with a 10mm head on it, and swap this round the other way. So the lever will work the opposite way to get the same input at the input shaft. Right, so I've changed this so it's opposite where it used to be, and ideally I want it with this angle at about 90 degrees, because if it's too tight that way or that way, you're not going to get a good gear change. So that's pretty good, but now my lever is in it as a slightly the wrong place. So I've undone the lock nuts on the bar, and I can just adjust the bar up and down to get the lever where I want it. So that's my gear lever positioned. It may take a little adjustment when I actually ride the bike to get it exactly where I want it, but we're now pretty good. So now we're up for first and down for the rest. Racy! Thanks for watching, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun.